So now we're going to pivot to our first plenary session on the top 10 recommendations that came from all of you. First, I'll do an introduction of those top 10 recommendations. And again, they came directly from the working groups from our last session. Please use your chat function to raise questions. So raise any questions you may have or comments, and Christy England, who is monitoring those chat functions, will bring those forward. And remember, we are going to use all we've learned in these sessions today and fold it into the first session to finalize the blueprint for regional resiliency. So how do we get to these top 10 recommendations? Well, they came from you, from the working groups. The working groups met about 3 weeks ago, and out of those working groups, 6 different working groups, 45 recommendations emerged, 45 findings and recommendations. Now, we have an organizing team of 6 individuals, and we took that large number of recommendations and synthesized them down to 25 recommendations that we thought were exceptional across all those 6 working groups. And we sent those back out to you and asked you to rank those recommendations and to sort of fill in the blanks, what was missing. You all responded, and with how you ranked those recommendations, these top 10 recommendations we're about to discuss came to the top. And with what you've advised on changes and modifications to those recommendations, we folded them in as well. So this product we're going to discuss now is really a product of all your input. So let's go through each of the top 10 recommendations by the working groups which developed them. So the first working group, and Christy, if you're able to put this on the screen, the first working group, okay, I'm so sorry. So again, as Deshaun said and as Isha said, we really need to look at this as a preliminary round, that what we can learn here will directly enable us to better meet the challenges of climate change. So with that in mind, let's go to the findings of the first working group. That first working group was how we live. And this working group really dug into how we can better shape our neighborhoods from both a brick and mortar perspective and also a social and physical health perspective. Now, they had 3 recommendations that percolated up to the top 10. They recognized that we are more and more living in dense communities. So how do we do that and live safely, live with and live well? They recognize that the pandemic has really put a stress on living densely. Now, they didn't say they had the direct answers to how to do that, but they had a way to get those answers. And what they said is, we need to bring 10 experts together, 10 public health experts, 10 urban experts together, and then let them blue sky, charge them to give us the best and most creative answers for how we make sure we continue to grow to live densely, but in a very safe perspective from public health and living well. So that was really interesting. They gave us a process, and a really creative process where we bring 10 folks, 10 experts together and ask them to get as creative as they can be, and let's see what 10 solutions they can move forward. This group also realized this is not just a bricks and mortar problem. That living well, living in our communities is not just bricks and mortar, that there's a major social element. And they said, we need to weave a better social net in our communities and improve the social care infrastructure from daycare availability to senior care. So if we're going to have stronger communities, it's about our social care we provide as well. Their third recommendation out of the top 10 was, again, out of every crisis comes an opportunity. And we have an opportunity here to rethink our neighborhoods. They had 5 different approaches they challenged us with in terms of how we can move ahead and rethink our neighborhoods. First, they called on all our city planning departments to really change their emphasis in how they plan, and much more focus on planning neighborhoods and communities for the residents who live there. And you'll see this in others of their recommendations too. But change the planning focus to the residents, and then business and commerce will naturally follow. They also recommended that there needed to be a fundamental shift in our growth and land use policies, our Growth Management Act, for instance, to be as much about promoting the social network, the social cohesion of our communities and neighborhoods and their public health as the more traditional concerns of zoning and uses. So time for a new GMA that really thinks about how we can live together with strong social cohesion, strong social network. They were also very pragmatic. It's about the money. It's about the money flow, and asked us to develop new ways to finance green homes and affordable homes. So how do we finance our neighborhoods? Let's find new affordable ways to do that, calling on the banks to work with us. And I thought it was really interesting. They recognize, particularly in underserved communities, home ownership is a major way to develop wealth. So they were driving towards new ways to actually have private home ownership. They also said we can expect a shift in our urban core and the demand for space in our urban core. As we all learn to work from home, there will be space opening up within our urban core. And how do we use that space to really serve our residents, whether it's housing or other ways to serve our residents? So let's take the opportunity of a changing urban core to better serve our cities. And their fifth recommendation and final recommendation was, let's make sure all of our neighborhoods meet a certain walkability score, where all basic needs and services are within 15 minutes of everyone's residence. That will make a truly great set of neighborhoods and a truly great city. You build a city that meets that walkability score, and all the rest will follow. So some incredible recommendations, some incredible findings and recommendations from this first group, How We Live. And I think that they also presented to us an overarching expectation. And that is to be sustainable as a region, to implement their recommendations is an all-in effort. It requires the engagement of not just government, but government and NGOs and businesses, especially banks, and educational institutions and social activist groups, that these are not normal times, these are not normal findings and recommendations, and they require us to work together in new ways across all sectors and people. Our next working group, How We Work. And Christy, if you can put that one on the screen. There were two findings and recommendations that came forward with the How We Work group. This group really found, first and fundamentally, that the pandemic highlighted the inequality of our workplaces. And they had two recommendations as a consequence. First was providing workers their due, that we need to really improve the conditions, the working conditions of our essential workers. And then they went on more generally, and they recognized that, of course, not just in the Pacific Northwest, but across the country, there is a greater and greater division between the haves and have-nots. There's a weakening of the middle class. And there have been a series of studies over the last decade that one of the major forces behind the middle class growth in the 50s and 60s and 70s was a strong union movement. So they recommended that it's time for us to pay more attention to unions and strengthen unions as a way of improving economic equality in our working among our working people. So two recommendations: really improve the working conditions of our essential workers and generally strengthen unions. And then they also pointed out that it has become very clear during this pandemic that our workplaces are inequitable. So what they suggested was a first step. And they said, as a first step, we should really make high quality diversity and equity training available to every business, every organization. recognizing that is a first step to a more equitable workplace. What they had said was this kind of education from diversity and equity training is critical so that as we move to become a more equitable place, it isn't just a matter of good intention, but we have the knowledge behind it to make real change. So again, I think from what we see from their findings and recommendations, it's again an all-in time, that they're not just calling on one sector to get engaged and changed. They're calling on all our sectors to work together. The next community, then the next working group was how do we create community? And this working group really focused on the social fabric of our neighborhoods. And their top recommendation that came forwards was how do we keep it real? How do we keep that social fabric real in a time of social distancing and where we're really relying on virtual communication? And they had two recommendations. One is, in fact, to engage in a series of virtual meetings where we ask neighbors their advice and recommendations and how to continue to have a lively and real social fabric within their neighborhoods, recognizing that we have this social distance requirement and that we're working more virtually. And then I thought this was really interesting. They said the social fabric in our neighborhoods, yeah, there's this policy element, but it's also about the storytelling. So we need to actually create what they call campfires, virtual campfires, where neighbors could come and continue to tell their stories about their neighborhoods, for their neighborhoods, and by their neighborhoods. So the storytelling, that sort of myth building around our neighborhoods, if you will, is very important to the social fabric. Those are the recommendations that came forward from the how we create community workplace. So I'm really intrigued by the breadth and disparity, the differences between these recommendations. They really create a whole package. Now let's go to our How We Build group. The How We Build group really took us down to the structure or building level in their recommendations. And it was clear they had a sort of let's wake up and act because of this pandemic. It's a dry run for climate change. And what they challenged us and what they recommended us to do is to really improve the efficiencies of our structures and buildings, particularly with energy. Our built environment is one of the major consumers of energy in this country. And if we're going to really reduce climate impacts, we need to become much more efficient in our energy usage on our building stock. And that was their overarching recommendation, as you can see in front of you. So that was our How We Build group. Next was our Where Are the Jobs working groups. And this group did exactly as its title implies. It explored where jobs could be created and the infrastructure that we need to have in place before we can even consider jobs. So there are two recommendations. First, making sure everyone has a path to employment. And here, we were charged at our first session by Governor Inslee to be bold. I think in this recommendation, this working group, the Where the Jobs working group, really took him at his word, and they made a very bold recommendation that the state of Washington develop a sustainable New Deal that could provide employment to all of us, to anyone who is seeking employment within the sustainability sector. Very much like the Green New Deal that is being discussed and debated at the federal level. So a real bold recommendation about jobs. But then they backed up and said there needs to be some infrastructure, basic infrastructure in place before we even consider job expansion. And that's that we need to really ramp up our critical public health infrastructure so that disruptive events like a pandemic do not cost so much job dislocation. So let's really improve our job infrastructure. And I know I am repeating myself, but my big takeaway from this is that, again, it's an all-in time, that these recommendations require all sectors and all people. Lastly, let's take a look at the How We Get Around working group. And like the How We Build working group, they took a very broad view across all types of transportation, all modes and methods of transportation. And what they came back with saying was, this pandemic is a dry run for climate, and we need to be about seriously reducing carbon production in these different methods and modes of transportation. And they have a series of very concrete recommendations for how we go about doing that. Now, we had one more working group, the place of the Pacific Northwest in the greater world. In the greater world. That working group had a number of findings and recommendations that, in fact, were folded into the recommendations you see before you with the top 10 recommendations of all the other working groups. So those are the top 10 recommendations, really diverse, interesting, and powerful recommendations from the top 10 working group, from the various working groups. I'll repeat myself again and say I think what they add up to is the recognition that we need to take this pandemic and all we've learned these 6 months to make change. That is a dry run for the climate challenge, and we need to take it to really become more resilient as we tackle climate, and that it's an all-in moment, that these changes will in fact require all sectors, from business to the nonprofit sector, to the educational sector, to government, to social activist groups, to come together and iron out and push these recommendations forward. So with that, I'd love to go to our panel. Our panel will be, as you know, we're inviting Jessyn and Isha back, and we're asking Jessyn Farrell to join us as well. Jessyn is one of the 6 of us who have really been behind organizing this convening. She has been the CEO of Transportation Choices. She has served in the state legislature, and she's now a leading voice with Civic Ventures. So Jessyn, thanks for joining us. And Isha and Jessyn, welcome back. So Jessyn, Jessyn, Isha, I'm going to start with a sort of your general feeling about these top 10 recommendations, and then we'll dive deeper down into specific questions. So let me start with a question to each of you as a way of your opening statements. Jessyn, hi Jessyn, you have rather incredible policy chops, right? So from that perspective, from a policy perspective, what's your overall sense of these top 10 recommendations? And you're on mute.
Great. Okay. Good morning, everyone. Isha and Jessyn, it's so great to get to be on a panel with you. And to all of you who are participating, I miss seeing you in person, and I can't wait until we get to do this in person again. You know, the biggest reflection that I had in looking at all of the recommendations was how much this theme of connection really came through. And it may be that that's in part because we are all missing the connections that we all used to have with each other. But at the same time, we also have greater connections in some ways with our immediate family. We're with them all the time. And with our immediate neighbors, but not so much with, people across the region, the way we might have had connections at one time. And it really makes me look particularly at that recommendation around really dramatically improving social care infrastructure. And that one's so important because it means investing in the workforce that provides social care. So many of those workers are women and women of color in particular. And creating a physical infrastructure that supports that, whether it's like making sure childcare facilities are in every single neighborhood, or making sure that our elders are able to age in place by ensuring that we have housing diversity in our neighborhoods. And then that issue of connectivity and family access to that kind of investment. And so, that's a big, bold idea, and there are a lot of big, bold ideas. And it just makes me, think about other places in our community where we've been able to do big, bold things, like in the transportation sector. I see a lot of faces of people who've worked on transportation issues over the years. And in that sector, you know, we had, you have planning mechanisms and funding mechanisms that allow us to have a common purpose and an intention. And I would love to see us bring those same things to some of these big ideas, like a Green New Deal or the social care infrastructure piece. And just as a final little observation, particularly again around social care, because I'm thinking about that so much with 3 kids at home. There are 470,000 kids in Washington State where both parents or all the adults in their household work. And we only know about how half of those kids used to get care before COVID. And we're flying blind on that other half. So there's this real moment where we can take these big ideas that we came up with through this process, but then really start to force a conversation around data and being able to see ourselves more clearly so that we can actually implement the solutions that go with them.
Thanks, Jessyn. And I think we saw a chat from Fed Fellerman, and it complements what you were saying right there. And one of the needs is to really make sure that the internet, that we have this sort of access for everyone. And I think you even mentioned that. Great. So let me switch over to Isha. Isha, you are an unquestioned leader in this upcoming generation, and you're soon going to inherit the Pacific Northwest and be responsible for caring and stewarding it. So sort of from that perspective, what struck you most forcibly about these top 10 recommendations?
Yeah, so I kind of will echo what you said earlier, Jean, in that I think I really appreciate how bold some of these recommendations are, especially with the statewide Green New Deal. I know a lot of grassroots activists have also been working on that and trying to get that passed. So I really appreciate that. And I think that particular resolution is kind of an example of how we've started thinking more holistically and more thoroughly about sustainability and regional resilience. Just because I think, you know, before, as environmentalists, we weren't really thinking about, you know, racial equity and the economic impact as much. But I think this is a really good example of where we are taking into consideration what limitations and constraints people are having now. And I think if there's one thing that COVID-19 has taught me, and this whole lockdown and quarantine situation, is that we need to have more empathy for people and what situations they're dealing with. Jessyn, you mentioned that you have 3 kids at home, and now I kind of understand that we need to change the way in the sustainability space. We need to change the way that we're talking to people if we want to get them to, you know, do things that are better for the environment and vote a certain way and pursue sustainability, because I think the way that we've been talking to people has not been as empathetic as it could be. And I think if we understand their challenges a little bit more, then we'll have a more successful time with our messaging.
Thank you, Isha. I don't know if your parrot is agreeing with you or disagreeing with you back there, but thank you for those words. And, you know, I've noticed myself, folks seem to be spending more time understanding the context and situation of the individuals they're working with and talking to. So that's a good outcome. Deshawn, my friend Deshawn, you're both a civil rights leader and a conservationist. So from that really interesting perspective, what struck you overall about these recommendations?
Well, again, I appreciate the opportunity to participate in a panel such as this with Jessyn, Farrell, and Isha. They're both fantastic. I've watched Jessyn lead on many different issues, so I mean, it is great to participate in a panel. And then Isha, I'm just awed by her energy and her perspective. And so I think as a society, we're doing something right, to develop such individuals as Isha. So I want to make this kind of really personal, because I think that speaks to some of the motivations around civil rights and social justice, but also sustainability. And I think Jessyn kind of related to it with 3 kids at home. COVID and this environment has changed me as a person. And because it's forced me to do things differently. I think I'm a good father. I think I'm a good elected leader. I think I'm a good worker. But being home and spending a different kind of time with my children has shown me that I can do something different and I can actually do it better. And I think there are these lessons that we are receiving in this time to do things better. So as it speaks to the recommendations have forced us, and I'll go back to the previous discussion, in a social experiment that says we can live successfully differently. So a couple of just quick things that I wanted to speak to, and then, maybe speak to the introduction that you created for me, Jean. So if we think about the social movement and the public unrest, and I go right to the first thing that Jessyn talked about, which was the social safety net. And I know I've been referencing how old I am, but maybe it's because I've seen us come full circle. I remember a time when we were trying to fight to save the social safety net. All the things that we said would occur in society, but we had a difficult time explaining all the benefits. Well, we're realizing what those benefits are. When you think about it, and when I talk to law enforcement, because I'm also on the Criminal Justice Training Commission for the state. And one of the things that we hear is that the police have been burdened with some of these things in our social society. So for example, the mental health infrastructure has fallen, drug and alcohol treatment. So we're going to have to prop that social safety net up, but we can do it differently, and then recognize that it's not waste, fraud, and abuse. It's actually providing tools for us all to kind of cope with real life experiences. And so I just wanted to hone in. And then also, we have a new definition after COVID of what infrastructure is. Infrastructure now, and I don't think it has been historically talked about, is transportation modes and other things. I can go on forever because I've been excited by how we build. And then maybe it's where the jobs are. So in that section, I think that spoke to me around the benefits of unions and representation, fighting for things like medical, healthcare. We all need it now. And it's just funny how life shows you things that maybe you should be doing differently. So that's what speaks to me, is like doing things differently and acknowledging the opportunities that are presented in front of us. And so that's it's changed me, and it will continue to change me.
Thanks, Deshaun. And I really, I'm taken with your comment that the pandemic has really retaught us the worth of our social safety net, if you will, and the need to reinvest in it. There was a comment in the chat function that we have not talked about affordable housing. And I just want to mention in the How We Live working group, one of their recommendations, in fact, is to create new financing mechanisms for green housing and affordable housing. So it is in the top 10 recommendations, maybe not enough, but it is in there. I want to ask you all an interesting question, one that Jess and I had a conversation about a couple of days ago. And that there seem to be these instances in our country's history where we've sort of dug deep and made fundamental changes. In the 1970s, we really looked at our environmental policy construct and came out with some groundbreaking policies that we still live under, such as the National Environmental Policy Act. In the 90s, we created the Growth Management Act in this state, which was a fundamental policy about how we live and develop. In the 1960s, there was the Civil Rights Movement with the Voting Rights Act. And though it's been attacked and weakened, it is still fundamental. In the 90s, we had Title IX. So there are these real fundamental sort of shifts in policy programs put forward. Is this a time, are we seeing a time now for one of those watershed events where in fact maybe we marry those two avenues of change, social justice and environment under sustainability? But is this one of those times where we are expecting and able to make fundamental change? And Jessyn, you look like you're primed to speak up there.
Maybe always.
Maybe always.
Yeah, I'm always ready.
Yeah.
You know, I think the thing that's really on my mind right now is that one of the ways we show up as our best selves in this region is when we're inventors and innovators. And these things are all fundamentally acts of creativity to invent new policy. Like another one that just came to my mind was the Americans with Disabilities Act. You know, that fundamentally changed people's access to our physical infrastructure and to workplaces and how important that was. So we have this moment where we get to really reinvent how we do things. And Isha and Deshawn really talked about, we've done this social experiment. We've already shown that we can do really big things. And so that to me is what we are called to do. And you know, particularly around affordable housing, I think a lot about how in the 1930s, one of the policy responses to the housing crisis of that time, where 25% of homeowners lost their homes, was we literally created a mortgage market. And of course, it was deeply racist and problematic in a lot of ways. But on the other hand, the 30-year fixed rate mortgage as a thing was invented. That didn't always exist. And so like, what are the new things that we can do to create new pathways to ownership, prioritizing people who are deliberately left out, the fact that Black and white wealth is so predicated on home ownership. You know, so how do we massively scale up land trusts and equitable co-ops? What's the next generation of accessible, stable, equitable mortgages that we really focus on building wealth and equity for members of our community who have been deliberately left out. So that's kind of what's on my mind. Like, we're really called to be inventors and creators, and that we can do it because we've done it in the past. And you know, and that's why this effort is so exciting, because we are literally doing that today and in the weeks to come.
So do you see a space to bring the social justice concerns and our environmental concerns together for some stronger foundation?
I mean, absolutely. I mean, and that is the call of the moment, you know, that if we don't do that, we fail the moment. And so, you know, again, I think the affordable housing one is a really great way to bring, we know that communities that are built around transit have a lower carbon footprint, have better health outcomes, and yet our transit investments have sped up gentrification and displacement. And so how do we invent and supercharge those anti-displacement measures, those you know, maybe financing and credit tools that really get people in housing and building wealth around housing? So as we're reimagining GMA and planning policies and funding policies, we have to be very deliberate around centering Black, Indigenous, other people of color who have been deliberately left out of that. And in doing so, we get major environmental benefits because we're utilizing the massive transit investments that we have created. So,
yeah, so they all do work together. Deshawn or Isha.
Yeah, I can pop in. I really love what Jessyn said, and I think I would just like to kind of go back and maybe reframe the question, because Jean, you're saying that, you know, we have this sustainability movement that started in the 70s or late 60s, and then we have this movement to advance social justice and equity. And I don't think a matter of marrying the two, but rather we can't have environmental justice and environmental sustainability if we don't repair existing inequalities. And I know somebody mentioned that in the chat, but I think the Clean Water Act is an example where that's something that has been very, very unequally enforced across different communities, and a bunch of other environmental policies, right? So it's not really true sustainability. And I would argue that it's maybe not as much of a shift as we think it is, just because not everybody was included in that movement. So I don't think it's a matter of marrying the two, but rather kind of fixing the holes.
Building that new table almost.
I love the comment of fixing the old.
He wasn't talking about you, Deshaun.
Well, and I think it's no. I think it's right. I think what we've acknowledged that some of our policies, and especially those of us that are policymakers, need to recognize the systemic racism that's been embedded in some of these things, right? And when I think about like the GI Bill and other things, even the kind of housing tools at the time, just know that in the Pacific Northwest, there were red line areas where people from my community could only live. And my grandfather served in the Korean War. He moved here from South Carolina, Charleston, South Carolina, and there was one place that he could buy a house.
Yeah.
I think it's an acknowledgement that systems need to change. And when we think about then, fast forward to 2020, we have been historically segregated or provided opportunities. And so now we have an opportunity to really develop what it means to have affordable housing options. So the scary thing is, as an elected official in the COVID time and in Tukwila, there is a significant concern, and it's going to be all right there, laid bare in front of us. We have a potential mass gentrification, eviction crisis waiting right on. We're on the cusp of that. So that means we need to fast forward these opportunities. And I really love some of the things that were brought up around land trust, right? Gene, you and I have been working on land trust for some time. Equitable co-ops, that's the next phase. And how do we make them financially work? And the way that it's developed right now is really our financial institutions have limitations, and they don't recognize what we all know to be true, what we've all seen in this time around systemic racism. And you hear about algorithms for being competitive for loans. And then the other thing I would say is that when it comes to transportation, right, and the Growth Management Act, which I think is just foundational policy that is still true now, but we also live in a society where you have to drive to qualify, right? And so that puts communities who could least afford housing at odds with the Growth Management Act. And again, they're not the only ones, but they are kind of something that we can fix by providing true affordable housing options. And then I think the last thing I would say in this time of COVID, when we talk about infrastructure investment, and this was something that came up in the Pacific Northwest, and I think it was also brought up in the chat around, it's a new meaning to infrastructure investment when you talk about Wi-Fi, right? So think about the school districts that are in areas where there may have been a lack of investment in fiber infrastructure. They're at home, potentially with no connection. And I know that in our group, there was talk about kind of groundbreaking agreements with some of the utilities. But just as an example, the minimum amount for kind of I think it's the $9 a month internet access that allows people to afford it, you have to qualify to access that amount. Not only do you have to qualify, but every 3 months you need to prove you still qualify. Right. So it becomes a barrier. And so think about those of us that have kids that need instruction, and yet they don't have the tools, whether it's because either a lack of investment, infrastructure, or staff to accomplish having a kind of the digital access. But that is something that has to be a statewide commitment to fix right now, because there are otherwise the only other option is you send, they'll say, well, we have to bring students in, which then puts them at risk. So I can digress really very quickly, but I just see there's some impending things that we need to work on a real solution, and not one that's maybe built from a position of have. How about we build it from a position of how do we make sure everyone has a minimum level of access with a minimum level of barriers, so that then that doesn't become something that then we have to have a significant financial solution, and honestly could create decades of problems going forward. So if kids aren't being educated because they don't have access in a certain part of the community, then we're all failing in this process. And I want to be positive because I feel like in this social experiment, we can do things differently.
So Deshaun, your passion readily comes through, and why you are such a forceful and powerful and positive Tacoma City Council person. You just presented a lot of factor. It's Tukwila, my apologies. A lot of fundamental change we need to pursue. But you also set up the next question I want to ask the three of you. I think we have time for one more question. And if there's any of the participants have a question, please come forward. So we'll try to be very concise. I'll raise a question, be concise. We'll see if anyone in the audience has a question, and then we'll go to closing statements. So listening to Deshaun, Isha, and Jessyn, it really sounds to me like, in fact, the recommendations and the changes we need to make, it's an all-in time. They can't be done in just one sector. These changes, you guys said it, these changes require banks and government, and business, NGOs, social activist groups. So those are groups that frequently act in their own channels, in their own silos. How do we create the relations needed for these recommendations and changes between all these various groups? How do we do that? I don't know.
Gene,
Deshaun's ready.
I'm ready, and I'm ready to be concise. And I think so I think it was already talked about in some of these recommendations around having conversations that haven't traditionally occurred. So how do you create those spaces in a virtual world, but you can advance some of the conversations? But I also think the other thing is all those sectors have work plans. What I would love to see is the intersection of those work plans. So Forterra's work plan matches the some element of the Duwamish River Cleanup Coalition, or something like that, where we can visibly show that we are interconnected and we're going to represent it in our individual work plans. And for all the things around equity and sustainability, those things be interwoven in their work plans. I think that's a way to do it, and it's a way to make yourself accountable to coming those coming up with those things. I'd love to see some of the utilities say, here's in our work plan that we've engaged with communities and NGOs of what they want to accomplish, and here's how we're going to do it in kind of a certain time frame. So that's my concise answer.
So thank you. So really put it right into their planning and capital budgets. Great. Jessyn.
Actually, Isha, why don't you take this one first, since I've had a chance to do that a couple times.
All right, awesome. Thank you. I think that, well, we talked about this during the last working group, which is that we just need more youth involved in all of these processes. I think that, you know, as we're determining all these targets for carbon emissions, and we're working on this deal and all of these other recommendations that we're planning on putting into practice, I think we need to have that table as well. Because if we're really talking about building regional resilience, then, you know, we're inheriting the region. We need to kind of be helping making decisions. And I think, gosh, there's one more thing I was going to say, and it just slipped my mind. But I do think that there needs to be more room for activism and grassroots activism in educational institutions and in the government, especially because right now I feel like there's kind of a divide between, you know, NGOs and then activists, and we're all kind of working on the same causes in a sense, but some of us have access to the government and educational institutions, and some of us don't have as much access. So I think just finding ways to include more youth and more grassroots organizers in those processes is really important.
And, you know, this question reminded me of this effort that the Seattle Times did in the late 90s. I don't know if anybody remembers it, but they basically created this offer where if you convened your neighbors to talk about transportation, they'd send pizza to your house and everybody could eat pizza together and talk about transportation. And I was like, sign me up. That sounds super fun. And so, you know, building on one of the recommendations around campfires and creating more avenues for us to talk to each other and actually listen to each other, I wonder if one of the things we can be doing proactively during COVID is really creating that space, you know, using trusted messengers, really thinking about the diverse ecosystem of people in our community and creating space for those conversations. And, you know, particularly for all of us white people, really practicing listening. And listening can be really hard. It means you have to kind of take yourself out of yourself, you know, and allow yourself to hear things without preconceived notions. But I think that there's this moment where our corporations, NGOs, government leaders can help create and facilitate space to really hash out what is it that we're going to do. These recommendations are a really good starting point, but what if we use them to jumpstart this really rich dialogue amongst, you know, all of us in all corners of our community?
So it's an all-in time, and it's going to require all of us and to break out of our molds. There's a question that came, there's a couple questions that came from the audience. And I think if we can do this quickly, we can answer one of them and then go to closing statements. And here's the big one. Are these recommendations really bold enough? And Isha, it seems like I've not brought you forward first, so now's your chance to come forward first.
Great. I think there are definitely some areas where we can be bolder. I think racial equity and advancing racial equity is an area that we need to be bolder in, because quite frankly, equity and inclusion training and diversity training just isn't enough. And, you know, we really need to, like, I think psychologically, we just need more awareness of our own pitfalls when it comes to racism and prejudice. I think a lot of us, you know, probably haven't even taken internal bias tests, and that's, you know, a start. And I think we need to actually dig deeper into not just our workplaces and kind of how our structure is in the present, how our organization structure is in the present, but also ourselves, and dig into our minds and think about, okay, what are our thought processes looking like? What are our biases looking like? And how that translates into our hiring practices, and that kind of thing. So, we can't, I think Einstein said, like, we can't solve a problem with the same logic that we used when we were creating it. And so I feel like by just doing diversity and inclusion trainings, we're kind of putting a Band-Aid on something, and we need to go deeper than that.
Great. Yeah. Thank you for that. Jessyn or Deshawn, are we bold enough in these top 10?
Well, I think that one of the core duties that we have is to really fundamentally rearrange power. And so I think that to the extent we can infuse that into these recommendations, that might help us get to a place where they are bold enough. I mean, I think the fundamental kind of ironic tension of this era is, on the one hand, we really need our institutions. In the era of Trump and creeping authoritarianism, we need institutions to work, and institutions have really not worked for a lot of people in our community. And so we have this problem and of how we strengthen institutions and transform them at the same time. And so I think if we can infuse these recommendations with that mindset and really, be frank about what power sharing would mean for all of us, I think that might get us in that direction. But that's a great question.
Yeah, that was a great answer. Deshawn, the challenge is on.
Yeah, oh, it is when you're on a panel and you have these two great answers to a very difficult question. I would say, so I'll take the obvious and say it's a start. I think it's actually a really good start. We're thinking outside the box. We're talking about rewiring. But that means that everything that has been established, say in the top 10, needs to be further unpacked, right? Because we're just scratching the surface of what our possibilities can be. And I think what we've learned, going back to what we're learning, I should say, is there's no benefit of either tiptoeing or avoiding the harder conversations, because then that just gets you into a collision, which we're in right now on many different levels. So don't have to kind of go into that, but it's more challenging ourselves to go further, because in the end, I think we would have a better outcome. I think because we haven't dealt with the issues as serious around the environment, we're tiptoeing around each other's positions and feelings and historic, connections and things like that. I'm just thinking about like neighborhoods. What are the stories we tell about our neighborhoods, right? If we tell the story that actually in Tukwila, I was able to buy my home in the 1960s for this small amount of money, and I had a blue collar job. But then when we talk about affordable housing now, it's, well, wait a minute. We bought this elaborate house for this much money and it's big and all that stuff. When the reality is, no, we brought a smaller house on, a smaller salary. So let's be honest about that storytelling too. Right. I got help to get this house or whatever. So I think if we continue, I just think we have to just go right at it. Don't tiptoe, take on the harder conversations, and then unpack what we've established.
Deshawn, that's great. That's a great way to wrap that question about how do we be bold. We have barely a minute left for each of you. So let's have a really quick close. And if you can, what's the one thing missing that you want to add to these top 10? And then we're going to move to the governors. So real quick, who's ready to go?
I think
All right, Deshawn.
Let's add more people to this conversation, because we're still missing some voices. So let's make sure to make space for more voices.
Great.
So that can go into the one thing missing and the one opportunity.
And there were some recommendations among the working groups to do that will come forward in the blueprint. Great. Thank you, Deshawn, so much.
Well, thank you everyone, first of all, for being here. And I would also echo what Deshawn said. I think we need more voices, more diverse voices, and youth voices too.
So seconding Deshawn, we need to broaden this. Great.
And I would say Deshawn really set us up. I think that is the answer, that we really need to go forth and listen to a lot of voices. And I also think that Isha really said it beautifully in her last answer around we need to be doing that inner work to allow us to get to a different frame so that we can actually be different coming out of this. So thank you, everyone. It's really been a delight to get to do this.
Thank you, Isha. Thank you, Deshawn. Thank you, Jessyn. We tackled these very hard recommendations, brick and mortar policy recommendations. And then at the end, we said, they're a great start. We need to hear from more people. And we need to think about ourselves and how we sort of change ourselves so we take on these recommendations in a way that they can last. Really good panel. Thank you for all your insight. Thank you for your time.